Thank you very much. I will argue that stress interrogation techniques were both necessary for getting information from suspected terrorists after 9/11 and effective in doing so. I will base my arguments on the actual experience of interrogators in Afghanistan and elsewhere. This is not a debate about torture. The stress methods that interrogators developed, such as short periods of sleep deprivation and isolation, were light years from torture. And to call them such degrades the moral opprobrium that rightly attaches to the term. As my colleagues will demonstrate, the use of stress techniques on terrorists is lawful. The burden, therefore, falls on our opponents to explain why legal and essential methods to gain critical information about future terrorist attacks should be off limits. It didn't take long for interrogators working in Afghanistan to realize that the traditional Army interrogation techniques were nearly useless against the al-Qaeda operatives and Taliban fighters whom the military was picking up in the fall of 2001. Those traditional techniques, a set of 16 psychological gambits assembled during the Cold War, were designed to help young Americans, soldiers, debrief Soviet prisoners of war on the battlefield. The 16 gambits had been crafted for use against conventional soldiers, lowly grunts conscripted into a state army who were often only too glad to be taken off the battlefield and out of the war. Army lore held that 95% of lawful prisoners of war would divulge information upon direct questioning. In Afghanistan, this ratio was reversed. Virtually none of the terror detainees was giving up information. Tried and true approaches, like appealing to a prisoner's love of family, often had little purchase. If an interrogator offered a jihadist prisoner contact with his wife or children in exchange for information, the jihadist might respond, quote, "I've divorced this life. I don't care about my family," end quote. Unlike lawful prisoners of war, the terror detainees were never off the battlefield. They continued their vicious attacks against their captors at every opportunity while in detention. Some of the detainees had been trained in resistance techniques and knew the limits of American interrogation rules. Others quickly learned what those limits were. So the interrogators began cautiously experimenting with stress techniques such as marathon questioning sessions or aggressive behavior to put a detainee on edge. The purpose of such methods was to recreate the shock of capture, that vulnerable mental state immediately following capture when a prisoner is most frightened, uncertain, and likely to give up information. Uncertainty is an interrogator's most powerful ally. It can lead the detainee to believe that the interrogator is in total control and holds the key to his future. An interrogator facing a resistant Taliban explosives maker, for example, might angrily hoist the prisoner up by his collar and storm out of the interrogation booth. The detainee had previously understood that American interrogators couldn't so much as lay a finger on them. Suddenly, he doesn't know what the interrogator's limits are. That frightening uncertainty can change his calculations about whether to cooperate. According to interrogators in Afghanistan and Guantanamo, stress worked. The harsher the methods that the questioners used, the sooner they got good information. Eventually, the military codified a set of stress techniques for use in Guantanamo and Iraq. These included keeping a detainee awake at night, putting him on cold Army rations instead of hot meals, isolation, environmental manipulation, and impersonating a foreign agent. All were hedged round with numerous bureaucratic and medical safeguards. None of the stress techniques that the military approved for use on terror detainees had anything to do with Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib was the result of the unconscionable and culpable breakdown of military discipline throughout the detention camp. Soldiers sprayed graffiti on the walls, engaged in public sexual misbehavior, and operated bootlegging and prostitution rings. Elliot Spitzer is not known to have used any of them. The guards' sadistic and sexualized treatment of prisoners was an extension of the chaos they were already wallowing in. It had nothing to do with interrogation. Had the rules for prisoner treatment and questioning been followed at Abu Ghraib, the abuse couldn't have happened. In conclusion, the stress interrogation techniques that interrogators developed to break detainees' resistance were necessary, effective, and lawful. They were far from torture. In certain instances, as Bob said, they resembled what Army recruits and professionals go through as part of their training. As a reality check, here's the Senate's definition of torture. It is that barbaric cruelty which lies at the top of the pyramid of human rights misconduct, such as sustained, systematic beating, application of electric currents to sensitive parts of the body, and tying up or hanging in positions that cause extreme pain.
1.
It would be reckless to ignore the experience of interrogators on the ground who came up against detainee resistance that was potentially catastrophic in consequence. Intelligence about terror planning is our only sure defense against attack. Nothing else matters. Interrogators facing the urgent need to get life-saving information from terrorists with likely knowledge of future plots should be allowed to use stress when the questioning techniques designed for lawful prisoners of war are not working. Thank you.